Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am back with another chapter. In fact, it's the very last chapter of Treasures of the Snow by Patricia St. John. We are on chapter 26. What a day! Sin forgiven, forgotten. Just as the weeks passed in the valley, so the weeks passed up in the mountains. The snows began to melt, and the little streams became torrents. The first flowers pushed up in the fields along the river. The cattle and the goats shut up in the stables began to stamp restlessly for freedom. South winds came sweeping up the valleys, and the sap in the pine trees rose and smelled sweet in the forest. Spring was coming to the mountains. Grandmother was busy with the spring house cleaning, and Father was busy with the new calves. This was a good thing, for when they were busy, they did not miss the children quite as much, although every new pink-nosed calf reminded Father of Danny. Grandmother, who was much too old and blind to be spring cleaning, would often sit down suddenly beside the half-scrubbed furniture, and half awake and half dreaming, she would imagine she heard the hop and the clatter of one shoe and one crutch climbing the steps and the happy sound of the little boy singing out a tune. She would waken to a sad silence and wonder for the 1,000th time how much longer it would be before they came home. Lucian missed them too. He lived farther up in the mountain than any other child, and he never walked home alone without wishing Annette was walking beside him. But he was not lonely or unhappy at school anymore. He had proved that he was sorry by his perilous journey across the mountain, and they had accepted him as one of themselves. And Lucian was different. Ever since that night when he had asked the Savior to come in, he had known there must be a difference. The old temper and the laziness and the unhappiness could not stay for long in a heart that was open to the love of Jesus. And gradually, Lucian began to find that as long as he kept close to the Lord by praying and reading his Bible every day, the love was stronger than he had bad temper and laziness, and that he was growing into a new sort of boy who could keep his temper when teased and who didn't mind doing unpleasant jobs. Often, when school was over, he would go across to Grandmother's house and help with the spring cleaning. They were fast friends. Indeed, Grandmother would hardly have known what to do without him, for he chopped her wood and did her shopping and brought letters up from the village, and this he liked doing, best of all, for they were usually from Annette. Grandmother always got him to read them aloud to her. There was sometimes a picture from Danny, too. Grandmother kept them all safely in the front of her Bible and often spread them out on the table to look at them. By the end of February, she had a collection of pictures entitled Me in Bed, Me Not in Bed, Me Chasing Goats, Me Having Medicine, Me and Nurse, Me and Annette, Me and Snowball Kitten. Grandmother thought they showed unusual promise, although in the last one she and Lucian had had some difficulty in making out which was me and which one was Snowball. Another sadness came into Lucian's life. His friend, the wood carver, was to leave the mountain and go down to the lake to live with his son, Monsieur Gavet. It had all been arranged that the afternoon when father and son had first recognized each other. He was to leave at the beginning of March, and the day before his departure, Lucian climbed up through the forest to help him pack. He had farmed out the goat and the cat and the hens and sold nearly all of his little carved figures, but he was not selling the house. He was just shutting it up to wait till he came back. I shall often come back, Lucian, he explained. I couldn't leave the mountain for long. I'll stop down there for a while, but then I shall hear the mountains calling me, and back I'll come for a bit of a holiday. He looked thoughtfully across the valley and then glanced around at the bare shelves of the hut. I'm taking a few of my figures for the children, he remarked. They may like them. And one, Lucian, I kept for you. I came across it when I was going over them the other night. It's one I thought I could not part with, but I'd like you to have it. If it you care for it. Lucian looked up eagerly. I'd love to have one, monsieur, he replied. It will remind me of you, and besides, I might be able to copy it. The old man went to the cupboard and drew out the gift that he had set aside for Lucian. He put it in the boy's hands and watched him closely. It looked simple enough at first sight. It was a wooden cross made of 2 pieces of rough wood, but the crossbeam was bound to the upright post by exquisitely carved ropes, twisted in knots, a filigree work of fine wood. Lucian's fingers touched the perfect work reverently, and he lifted shining eyes to his old master. It's beautiful, he cried. I can't think how you carved those ropes out of wood without breaking the wood. And then he added very shyly, it's the cross like the one on which Jesus was crucified, isn't it? Yes, replied the old man simply. I carved it the night my friend and master died, the night he spoke to me about the love and the mercy of God, and the night I believed I could be forgiven. Once you and I had a talk about loving. The cross is the place where we see love made perfect. Lucian looked up again quickly. Perfect love, he repeated. That's what it says in grandmother's text. It keeps coming. It's what Annette and I talked about the night before she left. Yes, agreed the old man. You'll often hear it. Perfect love. It means love that goes on doing until there isn't anything more to be done, and then goes on suffering until it can't suffer anymore. That's why when Jesus hung on the cross, he said, it is finished. There wasn't any sin left that couldn't be forgiven, not one sinner who couldn't be saved because he had died. He had loved perfectly. The old man seemed to have forgotten Lucian and to be talking to himself. Lucian was listening all the same. He said goodbye to the old man and promised to come up early the next morning and carry his pack to the station on his way to school. Then he came home through the spring twilight to the sound of the snow dripping from the branches as the warm wind stirred through them. He was in a hurry because he wanted to write Annette so the old man could take it with him in the next morning. But the first thing to do was to hang his cross carefully in his room. Then he ran out to the kitchen to find a pen and paper. The kitchen was in a mess. His mother was with the cows and had not had time to wash the pans or empty the bucket. Lucian usually helped her, but tonight he was in a hurry. If he slipped back into his bedroom, he could write undisturbed, and she would clear the mess and not know that he had come in. He hurried off and curled himself up on the floor by his bed. He was just starting when he happened to glance up and caught sight of the cross. He stared at it for a moment or two, thinking hard. What was it the old man had said? Perfect love. Strange he should hear those words again. Perfect love goes on doing till there isn't anything more to be done. And he, in some tiny measure, wanted to be like the Savior and to love perfectly too. And there were all those dirty pans out in the kitchen waiting to be washed. He blushed and he got up. When his mother came in half an hour later, she found the kitchen looking like a new pin and a happy-hearted Lucian sitting writing at the table. He went up to the old man early next morning while the forest was still dark, and they came down together, leaving the empty hut to wait for his return. As they reached the trees, the mist broke in the valley. The cocks crew and the sun touched the high peaks. The old man went off on the train that had carried away Annette and Danny, with his eyes fixed wistfully on the mountains. When flowers begin to come out, I shall come back, he reminded Lucian as the train was starting off. You write and tell me when they are out in the valley, and that will give me plenty of time to get back before they bloom on the mountain. Don't forget, Lucian. Lucian's reply was drowned by the clatter of milk churns as the train jolted off and disappeared around the bend of the hill. It was not very long after this that Lucian collected a letter for grandmother from the post office and hurried up the hill to give it to her because he knew it was from Annette. He clattered up the veranda steps shouting the good news, and grandmother came out eagerly. "Read it to me, Lucian," she said, and sat down in the sunshine, folding her hands and shutting her eyes so that she could listen carefully. It was a very short letter, and Lucian read it all in a breath. "Dear Father and Grandmother," it says, "Danny and I are coming home the day after tomorrow. Danny is quite well again. We are longing to see you, and Danny says please bring cloths to the station. Your loving Annette." There was also a note from Madame Gavette giving the exact time of their arrival and a masterpiece from Danny entitled "My Coming Home on the Train." Just for a few minutes, grandmother began to cry, the shaky little cry of a very tired old woman. But she quickly wiped away her tears and pretended to become a very strong woman because there was a lot to be done. "Go over to the shed and give that letter to Monsieur Bernier, Lucian," she said firmly, "and then come back here and help me right away. There's a lot to be done. Beds to be aired, cakes to be cooked, and the furniture to be rubbed up. We must have everything looking its best for the children." Father, on receiving the news, said, "Oh, and scratched his head. Then, for the first time in his life, he upset the milk pail and shortly afterward disappeared into the forest and didn't come back for a long time. The next day dawned clear and beautiful. There was no school. Lucian was up at daybreak, picking flowers and mountain laurel. He arranged them in a bowl on the veranda table and then set out for the station, walking slowly because there was plenty of time and plenty to think about. Grandmother, father, and Claus had gone in the mule cart. Surely, never had there been such a spring morning. The fields where the grass had been yellow and crushed were green and starred with flowers. The air was full of the sounds of bells of cattle, newly released from their winter prison and drunk with spring and liberty. Baby goats scampered in the meadows, and thrushes sang loudly from the orchards. The forests were heavy with the scent of sap, and the white mountain peaks pierced a sky so blue that it dazzled you to look at it. It was not unlike the day, just over a year ago, when Danny had fallen, thought Lucian. A clump of crocuses reminded him of it. What a dark day that had been. The very remembrance of it shadowed his happy thoughts. It had been his fault that they had ever had to go away, and perhaps after all they wouldn't be so pleased to see him. Annette had said Danny was well, but Lucian could hardly believe it. He reached the station rather nervous and stood apart with his hands in his pockets because he suddenly felt a little afraid of meeting them and wished he hadn't come. Many people were there so that the tiny platform was quite crowded. Father kept his eyes fixed on the far point down the valley where the train would appear between the mountains, and grandmother struggled with Claus, who, in a new pink bow, seemed to wish to set off down the line and meet the train. "It's coming," said Father, as everyone crowded forward except for Lucian, who was feeling shyer than ever. And now it had come, and Annette and Danny were at the window, rosy with excitement and clamoring to be out. Danny gave one glance at the group of beloved faces all pressed so close to welcome him, and in that glance he noticed Lucian standing there, and for an instant wondered why. His loving, happy little heart wanted to gather them all together about him, and he tumbled out of the train, broke through the crowd, and ran straight up to Lucian. "Look, Lucian," he shouted, "I can walk. Your doctor you found me made me better, and I can run just as though I had never fallen into the stream. Look, grandmother. Look, Daddy. I'm running without my crutch. And look, Claus, here's your kitten. Isn't he big? Grandmother, nearly as big as Claus. Claus and the kitten simply hated each other and snarled and scratched dreadfully. Danny and grandmother struggled to keep them apart. The crowd laughed. The train rattled off, and Annette clung to her father as though she would never ever let go of him again. Lucian turned away because there were tears in his eyes. He had been honored above everybody. His sin was forgiven and forgotten forever. Danny could walk just as though he had never fallen. As Lucian turned to notice, he noticed that the almond tree on the platform had burst into flower at the top. Yesterday there was nothing but its bare branches, but spring had proved too strong for it, and straight from the bare wood had come the starry pink blossoms. The winter was over and gone. The flowers had come to the earth, and the birds had begun their singing. And that is the end of this wonderful story, Treasures of the Snow, by Patricia St. John. And I think that was just a delightful story of love and forgiveness and the way that Jesus has in our hearts when he takes over and he sends the hate and the pride and the anger away, and he gives us his perfect love. Wasn't that a great story? I just loved it. And I have more books by Patricia St. John that I would love to read to you as well. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.